Good. Right. Let's start with jiggers because they're the easy bit. So the jigger, it's actually marked on your pattern. It's this little bit that looks like this, and essentially, hopefully you can see on here. You can see these little things here that have got lacing holes, and they just pull the waistcoat in at the back. So if you had a modern waistcoat, you would probably have a little strap made out of the same fabric as the back of the lining, and a little buckle, and it just cinches it in. And it's particularly important on these period waistcoats because we haven't got any waist shaping otherwise. We've got no darts. The only shaping, we've got a little bit of shaping on this slightly set back side seam. So this is one way of doing jiggers. I've got this horrible waistcoat down again. And they're the jiggers with the eyelets there, and they've set it all the way into the seam. I've done mine a little bit shorter, like that. So it's a very simple thing. It's just bagged through. There's two things to think about. The first thing is that the original waistcoats, the backs would have been in linen or something like that, something a bit more gutsy, and we're just using this very thin lining, and I think if we just use 2 layers of that and try to put eyelets through it, I don't think the eyelets would take, they wouldn't bite onto each other and be pulled straight out. So I just found a bit of calico in the strap bin, and I mounted my jigger on a bit of calico. You could put a bit of iron on, you could put a bit of canvas in, whatever you've got, but just think about what it's doing, and that will help you to sort of think about the fabric. So it's very simple, it's bagged through. The way it's going to go onto the waistcoat is a bit like doing the welt pockets. Remember you sewed the welt pockets facing downwards to start with, and they flip up. So it's sort of the same with this. So I'm going to sew it on in the wrong direction on the placement line, like that. And then I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to stitch again. I'm going to stitch there, I'm going to trim some of this seam out of the way, and I'm going to flip it over and stitch it so that the raw edge is hidden. Therefore, if I just did a longer version of this, if I continued this line straight, when I folded it over, I would see these horrible little corners. So all I've done, if you can see the stitching in the black, is I've gone down like that and I've just gone back on the same angle. So this line here is where I'm going to stitch, and I've just taken that angle down. And so, as usual, I'm just going to flip the corner right off diagonally.
And this is made out of lining fabric.
It's made out of your lining fabric, or whatever the back. It's basically made out of whatever the back of your waistcoat is. So in your case, it's lining. But as I said, 2 layers of lining, that's really flopsy-wopsy. So I would put something in it to make it a little bit stronger. And again, I'm going to have to clip in here because there's more fabric here in the seam allowance and less fabric here. So if I don't clip here, it won't turn through.
This is required for the 18th century one?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's marked on the pattern.
Okay.
So.
So we're stitching it through both the back piece and the lining piece.
Yeah. So you want to lay your back nice and flat on the table to make sure that they're sort of nice and aligned. Do that through. Give it a breath. So there's my little jigger. I've got my placement line. I'm going to place that on the line on the pattern. I'm just going to stitch that on. Brum, brum, brum on the machine. Trim off. Your seam allowance. Press it over with your friendly iron, and then I would just do another row of stitching here just to hide those raw edges. And then you want some eyelets. I mean, in this case, I would do 3 eyelets probably for the size. You can make bigger if you want to. It really doesn't matter. And they've got on that one they've got 3. Top tip for if you want to mark your eyelets really accurately. So mark your eyelets on one of your jiggers and put them in. So you've actually got them in the fabric. And then take your second jigger and line them up, and you can just mark the holes through the eyelets that you've already made. So that's a top tip when you come to do your corsets. So eyelet one side, and then lay them together and mark it, and then you get them spot on accurate, much more accurate than you will if you just try measuring them. Yeah, you can make me later. Right, that's jiggers. Any questions?
Did you say you're backing that with interfacing?
You just need to think about your fabric. That's
Because
the thing.
my fabric is pretty lining fabric's pretty thin.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if that would be smart to do, or if
Yeah.
we have any extra canvas.
Yeah.
No.
That's exactly what I said at the beginning. So
Sorry, I was over there. I didn't see that you were.
no
doing
worries.
my
So
bad.
yes, absolutely. I mean, that's why I put a bit of calico in. But yes, absolutely.
Okay.
You could put some iron on. You could put some canvas. You could put anything you want, because just lining, it's not going to stop looking at.
Okay.
And then just a little bit of shoelace or something to tie together, and you would adjust it on the person to fit. So they're nice and easy, yeah. Right, collars. So let's have a oh, that's lovely. So let's just have a little look at the stand and the shape of the neck. So if you look at the back of the body here, this is actually quite straight, and then it just tips up to the shoulder point. Well, here, if you look at it sideways, that's really scooping down. Yeah. And if I go and get the pattern. You can see the same thing. So you can see this is actually quite straight, and then it just tips up. So if you think about your back neck, you put your finger on your back neck, that runs quite straight. But here we're going right down in a curve. And the other thing about the neck is that it tapers, so it's going to be bigger here and smaller here. So if I measure, so that's 14 inches, and that's about 13¼ inches at the top. So the first thing I need to do to start my collar, because you're going to do your own collar patterns, okay? And I did this deliberately because A, I wanted to teach you how to measure a curve, and B, I was a bit worried that if I just put the collar pattern in there, everybody would just bash on and think they knew what they were doing, and we'd end up with some abominations. So hopefully none of that today. So what I suggest you do is that you actually start by measuring the neck on your pattern. The reason I want you to do it on your pattern is that it's quite possible that if you've made a mistake, if you've not been terribly accurate when you've joined up your shoulder seams, or if you've pulled things around a bit, then your fabric might have stretched a bit, particularly the wool. You know, has got quite a lot of give in it, although that's one of the reasons we put canvas into the front, is to try and stop that happening. But just in case. So I'm going to measure on the pattern because I think it's going to be more accurate than it is measuring on your garment. Remember sort of last time I went on and on about, you know, how you'd spent lots of time putting all the marks in, marking all your seam lines exactly, and then some of you not following them. So we're going to start by measuring on the pattern. And you remember that on your 18th century waistcoat, you've got your little button stand and you did your little step before the collar starts. So very unhelpfully, my tape measure has got a solid end. So I'm going to do we want to do centimetres or inches?
I would like inches, but that's just.
Yeah, I do inches. So is everybody okay with inches? So what I'm going to do, because I've got this solid end that won't bend round a curve, I'm going to start measuring from 10. Okay? And I'm going to see on the screen. So here's 10, here's my starting point. And I'm standing the tape measure up on end like that. And I'm measuring like that. And that is 4 3/4, is that right? Yes, that's right, because the one we did earlier was a Mongolian. So that's 4 3/4 inches on the front. I'll do the same thing on the back. So standing the tape measure up on end, starting at 10. And that is about 3 1/8. Okay. This is also the way, just in case you haven't been shown how to measure a curve, have you? Mm-hmm. No? Okay, so it would be the same thing for measuring an armhole. So you can't really sort of do it flat like this because it doesn't really work, and it's sort of, you're going to lose accuracy if you try and do that, and you're certainly going to lose accuracy if you round here and if you try and do it with a ruler, which somebody was talking about doing this morning. So if you stand it up, so it's actually at right angle to the table, that's really going to help. Yep. So I've got 4 3/4 and 3 1/8, so that makes 7 7/8 of an inch. Is everybody happy with my maths? The measurement on the Mongolian might be different, because the Mongolian we don't have the button stand, and it's just a different pattern. So don't take this number as gospel. And what I would like you to do is, I would also, before we start cutting that, I would just like you to check, lay your pattern piece on your waistcoat. Has anybody got an 18th century waistcoat to hand? Unfinished, yeah? Can I borrow yours? Thank you very much, very brave.
I haven't sewn my step yet.
Oh, you haven't sewn your step. Has anyone got an 18th century waistcoat with a step?
Yeah.
Come on, Sean. No pressure. It's your lucky day. It turned up on the bus. It's
Best day of my life. Guys, I left this on the bus and I got back on the same exact bus an hour later, only to find my waistcoat laying there. I know, you're all shocked. It's fine.
So you can see Sean's done his little step here. His little
Spraying like
stand.
crazy.
It is spraying like crazy, but there we go.
Okay.
So, oh God, you altered your shoulders, didn't you? So that's not going to help. So his original mark, the
Was right
original
there. That's where I
shoulder
left
line
the
is there. Yes, very well done. Okay, so let's just I'm just going to pin like that, so that nobody else gets confused like I did.
Yeah.
And I just want to check that matches. And it does look like that's stretched a little bit. Can you see?
Maybe.
Yeah. So yeah, in your case, I think I would just sort of measure that.
Yeah, I was
Just check to see if you're a lot out, just in case. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, assuming that everything is right and everything is happy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a rectangle. Seven and 7/8. And I'm going to look at my design. So it's exactly the same process for the Mongolian waistcoat and for the 18th century waistcoat. The collar on the 18th century waistcoat will be a little bit smaller just because that's the pattern. And obviously you have the little button stand. And on the Mongolian waistcoat, effectively you've got sort of buttons, you know, the little step, the button stand. Effectively on the Mongolian, you've just got a much larger one, just on the one side. And then on the other side, you're coming round dead to the centre front. So it should be fine. So I'm going to look at my design and I'm going to decide how deep I want to make that waistcoat, that collar, depending on my design. I mean, to me, this is higher than this. Obviously, this seems to have a little rounded corner, and this seems to have a straight corner. So let's say, shall we do it? Let's look at this one, and let's say, well, it's quite a similar depth to the pocket, yeah, just visually. And the pocket, I know, is 1.5 inches deep. So let's do the collar 1.5 inches deep. Just so you don't get confused, I'm going to label this centre back, fold, and I'm going to label that centre front. Yeah. Now let's just look at this for a minute. This is a little ethnic waistcoat, and you can see by the stripe that collar is an absolutely straight rectangle, like this. But you can also see what happens because it's a straight rectangle, and it does something a little bit peculiar at the front here. So instead of going up straight and continuing, it goes out at an angle because we've effectively put a straight thing onto a curved shape. Let's see if I can show you with a piece of paper. If I try and put that round there like that, it's not really very happy, and it's sort of sticking out a bit at the front. And it's, you can see that the angle's wrong. So what we really want to do is we want to get a little bit of curve into it so that it's going to sit nicer at the neck, and remembering that the top of our neck is smaller than the bottom of our neck. So I'm going to do that a really, really simple way. So I'm going to fold my collar in, I'm going to divide my collar into 4, my half collar into 4. So I'm just folding it. Like that. So draw in those fold lines. Okay. And I'm just going to fold, I'll cut that bottom edge off so that it fits. Just so we're really clear, I'm going to label this top, and I'm going to label this neck. Okay. And along these lines, I'm just going to fold out about 1/8 of an inch on the top to nothing at the bottom. And there. You can also do it, you can slash and overlap. So you can cut down almost to the bottom. And there's 1/8 of an inch. I'm just going to overlap that by 1/8 of an inch. This is where some sellotape would come in handy, but and if I put this on something not white, look, there's a nice handy stripe here. Can you see? And now it's a little bit of a curve. I'll pin that in if you can see. You see how that's curving? So here's my top neck. So I've actually reduced this half pattern by 3/8 of an inch in total. So if I double that, because my collar's cut on the fold, that's 3/4 of an inch. And that sounds about right to me. So this is quite a nice, simple, easy way for you to do your pattern. You might decide with your Mongolian waistcoat that you want to do it a little bit higher. You might decide you want to curve off the corner because that's what seems to be happening more in the design. But that's your pattern. And what I would do is I would then make a clean copy of the pattern, and I would do it on a piece of folded paper so that you've got a complete collar pattern. Yep, all good with that bit? Yep. Right, so now we come to making our collar up. So, yeah, here's the pattern. So I've taken a piece of my top fabric. I've matched the centre back. And I've put onto it a piece of canvas. Because this canvas is quite lightweight, I'm actually leaving it in the turnings at the top. But I don't really want to stitch through canvas round the neck edge because do you remember we got you to actually cut the canvas away from your armhole and from your centre front so that it, it wasn't too bulky and it allowed us to turn things through nicely. And it's going to be the same with this. This collar's a little bit fiddly to sew on. So this edge here at the bottom is absolutely the same as the bottom edge of my pattern, like that. And to make my life easier, I've marked my centre back and I've also marked where my shoulder points will come. So that, when we measured the front neck and the back neck. So if you measure from the centre back, the measurement you took, if you're marking the shoulder points, it's going to make it much easier to be accurate. You can see that mine is at the same place on the pattern. But I've left some seam allowance in the canvas just because this is quite soft canvas. And I've tacked it on. And in this case, hopefully you can see the white tacking. So here's my centre front and my top edge, my centre front. And in order to keep this in place, because I really don't want it shifting around and I want to make sure that I sew a nice fit. So I've done some quite small herringbone tapping to hold that in place, which will come out afterwards. So this is not like where you herringboned your seam allowance, so that this is just keeping it in place like that. And the way I'm going to suggest you do these collars, and it's the way I would do them, is I'm going to actually sort of make up the collar itself by hand. I'm not going to bag this through because I think it's easier and it's quicker and you get a nicer result. So if I show you on this not terribly lovely coat. Here's the collar, which has been machined on around the neck. No, actually that's gone on by hand, but we're going to machine ours on. And then this lining has just been slipped over all the way around by hand, just to hide all the mess and the nastiness. Yeah? So the first thing we're going to do because it's easier to do it while the collar is separate and in a small thing. So I've got my finished line here. So I'm going to do very much what you did on the hem. So I'm going to mitre that corner. And I'm going to mitre that corner. And I'm going to press this down. And as I said, I'm leaving the extra canvas in here because I think because this is quite soft canvas, it will give you a firmer edge. If I were using proper collar canvas, which is much, much stiffer, I would probably just cut a net shape. So sort of like you did with your welts and your welt pockets. So I'm going to press that down, and it shouldn't need clipping. Maybe if you've got a silk or something with not much giving, you might have to give it a little snip just to get round the curve. But the wool is quite, amenable. But at the moment, I'm going to leave my front edge open. So I'm going to do this. It's just much easier to do it before you put it on, rather than trying to sort of work with a bigger amount of bulk. So there's my collar. Let me just give it a quick press. There we are. And let's pretend that we've got our little step made out of this one. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that my lining and my top fabric, and here my lining and my top fabric, are lining up properly. And what I would probably do is I would do a little tiny machine stitch just inside your finished line. What you could do is run the foot, the centre of the foot along the stitch line, but just shift the needle over one position, just to hold the two layers together, because you don't want them shifting apart, but shifting around. And also because you're going to have to clip this curve, and you're going to have to clip this curve before you sew the collar on, otherwise you're really going to struggle. Because if we go back and look at the pattern, on the front, it's not too bad. I can pin that round, and that's going to come up like that, and it's going to be fine. But on the back, it's a much sharper, more sudden curve. So you don't really need to clip along here because it's quite straight, but you're going to want to clip, almost up to your finished line. So that's why I tend to put a little machine stitch in, not exactly where I'm going to stitch, but just inside. So it means that know that it's there and no further, and you know that things aren't going to flap around and whatever. And I suggest that you tack that collar on by hand before you put it under the machine, because that way you can check that you've got this really nice curve, really nice line, because again, it's like pocket, it's one of those things that's really going to show up if you mess it up. So you're going to machine your collar on, and the reason I left these front edges open is it means that you can machine up as far as there and stop, and then you're going to press all your seam allowance up into your collar. So when it goes on, it's going to turn up like that. Yeah. So all your seam's going up into your collar, and again, you can keep it all flat. You can do what you did on the inside with your canvas, and you can just herringbone your seam allowance onto the collar of your, onto the canvas of your collar, just to keep it flat, and give it a really nice press, and then you can remove the pin. Imagine me put on a step there, and then you can press that opening edge over and herringbone that down, and it just saves having to stitch through the two layers here, and it means chances are you're going to get a nicer, straighter, sharper edge. Yeah. And then my top hack for doing anything like this, and I use it for lots of things. I use it for things like patch pockets, and I've actually got some 18th century waistcoat flaps to show you, because I do them the same way. So what you want to do is you want a piece of lining cut according to your collar pattern, but very slightly smaller. You press all the edges under, and you're literally just going to lay that on, making sure you match your shoulder points properly, and you're just going to slip that on by hand. It's just sort of hiding the damage, really. It's not doing anything structural. So you can come and have a look at this one. And you can see they just slip round by hand, and they slip round by hand here. So my top hack is I take a piece of card, pattern card, which is, this is my collar pattern from this, and this is the same, but it's very slightly smaller. If you can see, it's just that tiny bit smaller, because the lining is a bit of a bugger to try and press, because it slips all over the place and it's very thin and it doesn't behave itself. So I take a strip of lining, I cut a pattern in some soft card or cornflakes packet or anything you've got kicking around, and I do it on the ironing board, and I fabric. And I lay that on like that, making sure I've got the grain correct. And I press it over the cardboard. And it just means you get a really nice, crisp, sharp edge. And it's done quite easier than trying to sort of mark it. And it would just, you know, and you can literally, you know, I use these long pins, but you can just pin directly down into the ironing board or something like that, and it just holds it, because the ironing board is a nice flat surface that you can sort of pin into. So that would be my top tip. So you've got your lining like that. Seam allowance has gone up. That's been folded in. And then this just sits over and you sweep it round by hand and everything's lovely. Yeah? And I just as a matter of interest, do you